The purpose of this video is to analyze the short-run trade-off between inflation and unemployment. This is going to be an introduction to Chapter 35, and it really expands upon what we've been discussing in the previous chapter regarding aggregate demand, aggregate supply, fiscal policy, and monetary policy. The first key point here is that in the long run, inflation and unemployment are unrelated. So really what we're saying here is that the inflation rate depends mostly on growth in the money supply. And we've studied that before. We said we have to be very careful with the Fed, and we don't want to just be printing money and causing this inflation, right? So this is a review of what we've discussed before. Unemployment depends on things like on the minimum wage, the market power of unions, and many other factors. Today, we're going to learn the Phillips curve. And the Phillips curve shows us the short run, key term there, short run trade-off between inflation, that is the increase in the price level, and unemployment. A little history: in 1958, Phillips showed that the nominal wage growth was negatively correlated with unemployment in Britain. And then in 1960, two famous American economists, Samuelson and Solow, and some of you may have done your projects on them this past fall, found a negative correlation again between US inflation and unemployment. And as an homage, they named it the Phillips curve. And let's look at how we can derive this. Let's suppose that the price level is 100 this year. And we're going to look at two different graphs. We're going to look at a scenario where the aggregate demand is low, AD is low, and we have a small increase in the price level, meaning low inflation. And in our other scenario, AD is high, and we have a big increase in the price level and resulting high output and low unemployment. So let's look at this in detail. On the left here, this is our aggregate demand, aggregate supply model. We've been studying this. Notice we look at SRAS, the short run. This is our price level. This is our real GDP. And we have our first aggregate demand low here, low inflation. Okay, and we can see our equilibrium point. And this will end up being our Phillips curve here on the right. Notice we are plotting inflation on the y-axis and unemployment rate on the x-axis. Now let's look at point B. And in this scenario, we have a higher aggregate demand. Sure, that looks about right. We have a higher inflation. Price level went up. Good. And as we moved out this way, right, the unemployment went down. So this is a lower unemployment rate. So if we go to plot point B, on the right side on our Phillips curve, it will look something like this. Point B here, right, it has a higher level of inflation and lower unemployment rate. And we can see here, if we connect these dots and try to create a line out of this, we start creating our Phillips curve. So again, the Phillips curve relates inflation to the unemployment rate. Now, what we've been discussing all along are policies, and we've talked about fiscal versus monetary policy. And so we want to look at fiscal and monetary policy, how they affect aggregate demand. And the Phillips curve, right, offers policymakers a menu of choices. So your options are low unemployment with higher inflation, or low inflation with high unemployment. Or we have anything in between. Actually, it's very interesting. In the 1960s, data did support the Phillips curve, and many people believe that it was stable and reliable. And so if we look here at data from the 1960s, you're going to notice that it's almost perfect, right? It's almost a perfect Phillips curve. But it's important to notice here that it's not just about this negative slope, but the movement over the years. So we had expansionary fiscal policy. All right, and this was in part due to the Vietnam War. And at the same time, the Fed wanted to keep interest rates low. So the Fed we also had expansionary monetary policy. And so the net result of this, right, and we saw this in class in our previous lesson, is that aggregate demand grows. It increases in the 1960s by this Phillips curve. So from 1961 to 1968, our unemployment decreases, but notice inflation goes up. My favorite, Milton Friedman and then Phelps argue that the trade-off was just temporary. All right, so they're saying that eventually these gains in unemployment are going to go back to the natural rate regardless of the inflation rate. And this is going back to what we've talked about before, this classical dichotomy and the shape of the vertical long run aggregate supply curve. So here we go. Let's look at the long run Phillips curve. We have LRAS on our left. This is our aggregate demand, aggregate supply model. And on this side, we have the Phillips curve. Let's call it PC. And so let's look at this here. We have our first set of data points for aggregate demand. And now let's expand the economy. All right, so we're going to have some expansionary policy. We're going to shift aggregate demand to the right. Here we go. And let's plot the new point. But so the point is we're expanding the economy, but really all we're doing is creating more inflation in the long run. And so because this natural rate of unemployment is what we're always going to end up going back to in the long run, we're really not getting a lot of gains. And so this gets back to the issue of the money supply. Increasing the money supply is going to lead us to inflation in the long run. And that is what we see from the Phillips curve. Looking at historical data, data from the 60s shows that the Phillips curve does slopes downward. In theory, right, according to Friedman and Phelps, the Phillips curve is vertical in the long run. And so in order to kind of bridge this gap, they come up with this concept of the expected inflation. And we've talked about expectations before, but the expected inflation is a measure of how much people expect. What do they think the price level will become? Our unemployment rate is equal to the natural rate of unemployment minus A times the actual inflation minus expected inflation. And this equation is basically the equation for aggregate supply introduced in our previous chapter. A is a coefficient. So it's a positive number, and it measures the relationship between the unexpected inflation and deviations of employment. In the short run, the Fed can reduce the unemployment rate below the natural unemployment rate by making inflation greater than expected. So it's not just increasing inflation, it's greater than what people had expected it to. In the long run, expectations can catch up. The unemployment rate goes back to that natural unemployment rate, whether inflation is high or low. So the point here is that eventually the expectations catch up with reality. People see that the inflation is higher than they expected, so they adjust accordingly and adjust their actions accordingly in the economy. Now, if the Fed, has policies that are going to cause some inflation and increase inflation 2% higher than expected, the unemployment rate is going to fall to 4%. But notice in the long run, because the inflation is expected to increase to 5%, that Phillips curve will shift back. So here's the shift back here in the long run. It shifts back, and the unemployment returns to its natural rate. This was what we called the natural rate. Take a moment to do this problem. You can pause the video and then restart it when you are ready to continue. Oh, so let's graph this out. We have our long run Phillips curve here at 5%. This is our natural rate of unemployment that was given. And we are going to plot our Phillips curve for point B. And notice a shift to the right for point C because we have this increase in expected inflation. A fall in the natural rate shifts both of the curves to the left. It's interesting to kind of look at historically what happened to the Phillips curve. If we look at the early 1970s, unemployment increased despite the higher inflation. And so notice from 1969 to 1973, we have an increase. And people start adjusting their expectations of inflation upward, and this causes the Phillips curve to shift upward. And this is consistent with the work that was done by the economists Friedman and Phelps. And they said, look, in the long term, it's going to do nothing but cause inflation, this trade-off. We've talked about supply shocks before, and these are really important when we're talking about aggregate supply. We said whenever you think of an oil shock, oil price changes, think in this aggregate supply shock and this shift in the aggregate supply curve in our model. So we have our aggregate demand, aggregate supply model here, and then we have our Phillips curve on the left with our inflation and unemployment. Okay, we have an oil shock. Okay, and so our aggregate supply curve is going to shift to the left. And as we would expect, our output falls, our unemployment actually increases, and our price level increases. This is our inflation happening here. If we look at the right, at the Phillips curve, remember that point B will be plotted further out on a different Phillips curve. And so we see here that an adverse supply shock is also going to shift the short run Phillips curve to the right. And it's like a worsening, right? This is worse. This trade-off becomes worse between our unemployment rate and our inflation rate. If we look at some price levels here for oil, and we want to talk about a price shock, we can see it here, right? $3 to $10. And so the Fed responds, right? The Fed sees this as a major problem, and so they're going to cause the money supply to grow. And of course, this causes expected inflation with further shifts the Phillips curve. And the prices keep going up, and it makes the trade-off even worse. And here we go. Here's an expanded view of our Phillips curve. 1979 really is a pivotal year. This is when we have the OPEC and the Iranian Revolution, and we kind of start literally spiraling in problems. So supply shocks cause rising in expected inflation to worsen, and we have a worse trade-off for the Phillips